Do we need to apologize? And I will say no, we don't need to apologize. And I'll show you the reasons why. Okay, here are a couple statements that were made by anti-creationists. There are quite a few of those in the United States, and they write some really nasty things. But here's two statements. No creationist has contributed a single article to any reputable scientific journal. Second one, both these guys have written anti-creation books. They're very activist against us. Flood geology shows no promise of fruitful interchange with other sciences. It does not aim at advancing science. It does not seek to extend the range of phenomena that are open to scientific investigation. Okay, just kind of remember that slide, and we're going to come back to it later, and you can see if you agree with it. Okay, just to review a couple things. Can belief in creation introduce a bias in research? Can it hamper scientific research? Yeah, the answer is both, is yes, it can, but it doesn't need to do so if we approach it right. Everyone has a worldview. Any worldview can introduce a bias. There are ways to avoid bias, and I'm going to talk about that. Start off with this little diagram. Here we have a science domain talking about what science does. It develops hypotheses, it tests them, and it keeps going around in circles. And it does this by observations, experiments, analysis. Now, over here in the religion domain, there are some similar things happening. We develop religious concepts, we test them, but not with experiments. We do this, we study the Bible more carefully, and attempt to determine what it really says, compare Scripture with Scripture. This is the way religion works. Now, there are many people who would say, okay, these are in fact entirely separate. You keep them separate. You don't try to mix them. But I would suggest there's a better way. That if you do that, what typically happens is then people take science as a standard. Religion becomes sort of emotional, whatever. But here's a thinking process that I call the interface. Sometimes science will challenge what the Bible says, or the other way, the Bible will challenge what science says. So what do we do then? When these conflicts arise, these challenges can make us study the Bible more carefully. The challenges that go this way, it challenges our interpretation of scientific data, makes us think more deeply and collect more data. So by looking at religion and science and trying to understand how they relate to each other, it can stimulate us to study both more carefully. And I'd like to make the prediction here. In fact, I'll make a statement, and we'll show you examples of how this works. The Bible can suggest hypotheses in geology or biology that we might not have thought of otherwise. And so I will never let science directly test the Bible, nor will I let the Bible directly test science. But it makes us study both, and we can come up with ideas from the Bible that we can then introduce into science and make discoveries. Okay, a worldview can influence some things. I don't do research differently than anybody else does. I collect data the same way. I analyze it with the same instruments. This is all the same. What is different? The difference is the questions we ask, what answers are feasible, and the types of evidence we're likely to notice. Like I gave my little example of the Ford Explorer. I never saw them before, but once I knew about them, I saw them all over. So our experience and our worldview can influence what we're likely to see and the questions we ask. Okay, and we can also ask another question. Who uses this process to the best advantage to avoid bias? Bible believers or those who use methodological naturalism? Okay, think about that, and we'll come back to that one in a bit. Okay, I'm going to start off with a research project that went for about 10 years that Dr. Arthur Chadwick and I did with other collaborators. And We spent about 10 summers down in the Pisco Basin in Peru. My other collaborators, these were 2 graduate students. These were other geologists from my university, and these were some South Americans who worked with us. This was probably the most productive paleontologist in Peru, at least, maybe in more of South America. He became a very dear friend, worked with us in all of our research. Chadwick and I were down there in Peru giving some talks one time, and somebody said, "You want to see some fossil whales?" Well, of course we would. When a non-scientist asks that question, you never know what you're going to see. But indeed, there clearly were whales, and we immediately saw the need for some research. This is a view of the Pisco Formation. It's layers of sand, fine sand, and a lot of diatoms, especially the upper part here is diatomite, lots of diatom skeletons. And that's where the whales are. You can see we're looking across here towards the Andes, and this picture shows it a little more clearly. Here I'm standing on top of the Pisco Formation, looking to the Andes and the foothills, and this is the driest desert in the world. It does not rain here. I've seen a figure of an average of 1 millimeter per year. It's absolutely dry. The only vegetation and people you'll see are along these rivers coming out of the Andes. These are the Andes, and this is a coastal plain. And the green parts here are the outcrops of Pisco Formation. And so it goes about 200 kilometers from down here all the way up here near the town of Ica and Ocucaji. And just to give you an idea of if you're familiar with the geologic column, these are up here in Miocene and Lower Pliocene. It's a beautiful place in its own way. There are quite a few areas that have extensive modern sand dunes. These are not rock; these are just modern sand dunes. And there are no plants except for this one. On the higher hills, where you get a mist, sort of a moist air coming in from the ocean in the morning, you have this plant. So it was kind of like the Garden of Eden. No rain, just a mist in the morning. But anyway, this plant, you can pick it up, look at it, put it back down. It has no roots. There's no use for roots when there's no water in the soil. It just sits there on the surface, and the sand kind of makes an anchor to hold it there. And we usually stayed with a family in town. When we were way out, a long ways away from town, we would camp sometimes. And you can see it's not like a beautiful campsite. This is our nicest one. This hill was called Brujita, so this was our Brujita Hilton campsite. Making our meal here in the pickup. This is our friend Mario, the Peruvian paleontologist. He didn't have any religious background as far as I could tell, but he'd come in and listen to our worships, and he'd help us cook vegetarian food, and he became a very dear friend. There are a lot of fossils there, and they're all beautifully preserved. Here's the whole mouthful of teeth from a shark. Fish, you see all the bones are there, very well preserved. And there are porpoises. Here's a fossil skull. Here's one porpoise in place in the sand. There are penguins. Look at these skeletons. Every bit is there, well preserved. And everything is like that. There's a turtle. This is a marine turtle. This turtle is about the size of a small car. And some bones with pathology preserved. They also found at least one complete shark skeleton. Now, a shark skeleton is not bone, that's cartilage. And you have the complete skeleton. I don't have a picture of it. But we focused on the whales. There were lots and lots of whales. A whale has a huge skull, and then the vertebrae come back, and the ribs, and then the flippers. Okay, and we found many whales basically complete. And you find them here buried in the sand, partly covered. And you find them in various states. This one, you can see the skull, it's all there. The vertebral column is here. The ribs are sort of broken up because of modern erosion. And the flippers are there. But there are a lot of whales. They are related to fin whales and sei whales and blue whales. That's their relative. The ones we have here are extinct species, but they're related to our modern whales. And so here we have a few more specimens. The skull and the vertebrae. Here's another one. And we mapped the location of these whales using a sophisticated GPS system. It actually had more precision than we needed, but this was the equipment we had to work with. This will give you, here's the base station, and then the rover that you carry with you to map your whales. And this will tell you the location of your spot within less than a centimeter. This is extremely precise equipment. And if we mix some new technology with some old technology, we could collect data real fast. We talked Raul into posing for this, and it wasn't too hard to do a little modification. Okay, so whales. Here's a map of our main study area. And each of these dots is a whale. Now notice the red ones are complete whales, the black ones are partial whales, but the partial whales almost always is simply due to modern erosion, that is, it eroded away parts of the whale. And the evidence seems to indicate that just about all of these were complete whales and very well preserved. And this, you notice this is 1 kilometer. So there are 360 whales in roughly 2 square kilometers. That's a lot of whales. What time did we start? Okay, anyway, I'll have to finish by about past or less. So lots and lots of whales. And you look here, this is the hillside. They're mostly, we studied the ones that are mostly on top. There are not so many down here. And this gives you how many whales there are. Notice up here you have probably 350 whales per square kilometer. This is not a normal kind of situation. You don't find whales in that density out in the ocean now. Okay, they're in, these whales in the upper part are in diatomite. Diatoms are little microscopic organisms that live in the lakes and in the ocean. And they're, the ones in our study area were pristine, beautifully preserved. This is generally not the case. They usually sink down through the ocean and largely dissolve. But here they are just beautiful little creatures. And there are people who study taphonomy of whales. Taphonomy is a study of how things what happens to things after they die. How do they get fossilized and preserved? And there are people who study whales today out in the ocean that have just died and sunk. And these 3 pictures I'll show will illustrate what happens. Okay, the first, when they sink down there are thousands of invertebrates that collect on the whale, and they eat all the flesh. Within maybe 6 months or less, the flesh is gone. You just have bones. And then another crew starts in and working on the bone, eating parts of it, making holes in it. Within a few years, the bone is just broken up and gone. So whales do not last very long when they fall down in the ocean. And what caught our attention right away when we got here is that these sediments are believed to accumulate only in a depth of a few centimeters per 1,000 years, because that's the way it happens in the ocean today. A few centimeters per 1,000 years. And yet, why are these whales so well preserved? If it would take, a few centimeters per 1,000 years, it might take 10,000 years to cover this whale. But that doesn't happen. When whales die, they're gone within a few years, and the flesh is gone within a few months. And so why, other paleontologists and geologists have been studying here for 20 years, and nobody had raised this question. What's happening? How could this be? Very slow sediments, and yet beautifully preserved whales. Even here you have the baleen, the filter material in the mouth, which is not bone, it's softer tissue. And today it disappears very quickly, and yet we have baleen in these whales. Right here there's baleen preserved. All right, so what's going on here? And our thought is immediately that sediment did not accumulate that fast. It had to have been much faster to preserve these whales. Okay, why didn't others think of that? Why didn't they notice it? Well, I think it's just your worldview has a lot of influence on what you will notice. And the idea of a very rapid sedimentation here was not in accord with the usual theories, geological theories. But we noticed it immediately. It struck us right in the face. There's a problem here. So we began to study it. When you find a whale that's just barely showing at the surface, you excavate it, then you see what it's really like inside. And this is one we call Carmen. This is the part that was exposed on the surface, but the rest of it, the bone, is beautiful. It has no evidence of animals chewing on it, burrowing into it. There's no evidence in the sediments of things burrowing. This one had this complete flipper, and all these bones preserved, but there was no flipper here. Now, wonder what happened. Well, we do find shark teeth around these whales, so that's probably a good explanation of what happened to this flipper. Here's another one. There are just so many of these whales all over, and you'll find them up here on the hills, beautifully preserved. And here's a little one that was also, we excavated this, it was buried. It's a little one, maybe 2 meters long, but it's very beautifully preserved. And you notice the skull is right here, and around it you have this sediment that is yellowish. Just around the bones. Okay, that's something you find fairly common in fossils if there was some biological tissue, some soft tissue still there. The decay of that tissue sets up chemical reactions that lay down this other kind of sediment, this modified sediment. And so further indication that these were buried rapidly. Here's one of our favorites. We call this the smiling whale. You notice the baleen? This is the skull, back of the skull and the vertebrae, and the whole set of baleen is still there. The smiling whale. And we could each pose here and get our picture taken to show that we found that whale. But that was a very beautiful specimen. Okay, here's another one that we excavated. This was the first one we excavated. Every bone is in place, except for a couple of the last tail vertebrae. The flippers are all there, the ribs. There's a slab of baleen that came out of the mouth and landed right there. How could that lay there for thousands of years? Well, it just really isn't feasible. And here is a picture that shows in a little excavation we did beside the bones. This is the edge of a vertebrae. The big vertebrae are very big, and here's the vertebrae, and here you see all this sediment that is stained by from the decay. And you can see the lines of diatomite. This soil is undisturbed. It has not had organisms burrowing through it. This all happened very quickly. And here's a piece of the baleen. And these are the baleen plates, and this is sediment between them. And right here is some of the baleen exposed on the surface. And this is a microscopic view. This is still protein. Okay, supposedly this thing is 12 million years old, and yet it has protein preserved. And we know that proteins don't last that long. And in fact, if you take a little piece of this stuff and look at under an electron microscope, you see that it's composed of layer after layer of very fine fibrous material. So this is this is 20 micrometers. This is very thin, yet has this fine structure There's no way that was preserved unless it was buried within days, perhaps. Here's our whole crew with the smiling whale. Okay, so where'd you get all these diatoms to bury these things? Well, that's a very good question in itself. Diatoms and other similar organisms live near the surface of the ocean, and when you have a lot of nutrients being brought in quickly, you have enormous reproduction of these. Red tides are an example of this. Great multiplication spurts of these. What you need for that to happen is a lot of nutrients. Like for here in this area, you have upwelling of cold water, brings nutrients. There's a lot of volcanic ash, which has iron that they need. And so you can have a lot of multiplication of diatoms. And here's these diatom mats come in very large, enormous amounts of those diatoms. And when these massive amounts of diatom die and begin to settle out of the water, they become toxic, poisonous. And here in California, there were several hundred sea lions that were killed all of a sudden during one of these toxic blooms, red tides, and they were linked to the death the deaths were linked to diatom toxins. So that can happen, and probably this is what killed these whales. You had a lot of overproduction of diatoms, they became toxic, and it killed the whales. And our conclusion that this had to happen very rapidly is not one that the rest of the scientific community came to. They didn't notice what we saw. But if you do good work, you still have a good option of getting it published. And these are some of the publications. This is a journal, Geology. That's published by the Geological Society of America. It's the most prestigious journal in the field of geology. And they published our article with our whale picture on the cover. And so, like I say, if you do careful work, and you can get it published. Now, you have to be careful. We didn't say that this challenges the geological timescale. We didn't go that far. You just stick exactly what you can say with your data, and you can get it published. And I think this does challenge, the geological timescale. It doesn't prove anything one way or the other, but it challenges it. And we got a number of papers published. And before we submitted this for publication, we got feedback. We discussed it with some of the top people in taphonomy and in diatoms, and they said, "Yeah, your data proves your point," and so we got it published. Okay, conclusions. The numerous fossil whales are well preserved. They were not beached. They were not stranded on the beach. They sank in shallow water. There's no indications of some strange condition that would prevent decay. So this preservation requires rapid burial, and the evidence is that the diatomate and sands and silts accumulated several orders of magnitude faster than usually believed. Now, an interesting thing happened. From the study on modern whales and from our data, it seemed to me that each whale had to have been buried within weeks to months at the most. But I thought, that'll never get published. That's too radical. So I softened it a little bit, and I said each one had to have been buried in months to a few years. Well, I discussed this with one of the very top vertebrate taphonomists, and she turned out to be one of my reviewers for that article. She came to that part, and she said, well, the data really says it has to be faster than that, weeks or months. So I changed it back the way it should have been and got that published. So what do you think about these two statements? Obviously, these guys have no clue what's really going on. And we don't go out and advertise what we're doing. Yet, for 30 years, I've been openly publishing creationist articles and books. And some of the scientists out there who review our articles I know we're creationists. But we still got published, And this is only one example. There are many examples of articles that we publish that get published in good journals. Okay, I'm just going to briefly mention several other projects. For about 10 years before the whale project, I worked on taphonomy of turtles in Wyoming. Okay, worked with 2 other geologists from my department. There are thousands and thousands of these turtles. The Bridger Formation is very rich. It's been studied since 1869, but the paleontologists mostly collect the mammals. They ignore the turtles. So there's still plenty of turtles to study, and we found that these are again, mass killings, mass deaths of turtles because of volcanic ash covering the area, and so they were buried very rapidly by these processes. And again, nobody had paid attention to this. Nobody had studied this before, and yet there'd been massive research on the Bridger Formation for 150 years. Well, they didn't notice, but our worldview led us to notice that there's something odd here that needs to be studied. Trackways in the Permian Coconino sandstone in Arizona. I studied this off and on through the years. The only fossils in this sandstone are trackways of reptiles or amphibians. And you know, I saw this, and it was this sand deposit is believed to be wind-blown sand, aeolian, that is wind-blown desert sand. And yet I wondered, okay, how do you fit a desert into the flood? And so I started studying it. And I found there are some very, very unusual things in these tracks. This is a kind of a normal track going that way. Here's a trackway of an animal. It's going either this way or that way, and yet all the toe prints are pointing this way. What's going on? Animals don't walk sideways like that, except for crabs. But we did some experiments and found that if these are underwater, you can explain that. If the animal is trying to walk this way, but a gentle current can drift them sideways, and you end up with a track like this. And also, here's even a better evidence. Okay, this trackway is going this way. There should be clear tracks here and here and here, but there's nothing there. How do you explain that? Well, on a desert dune, I don't see any way to explain that, and nobody's been able to explain it. But underwater, it's easy. They swim down, walk, and swim up, and the track stops. So that got published also, several articles published on that. Most of the geologists don't like these papers, but it was good work and it got published. And then there's more research that we were doing, and just briefly go through this. I mentioned this a little while ago, the Moenkopi and Scherner conglomerate contact. Okay, here's that contact where there's supposed to be 10 to 20 million years of time in there with nothing happening. Well, you know, it really doesn't work. It's just, there's no evidence of the passage of time here. Here's the bottom of a rock that fell over, and you do see something here. These are load casts. The sand and pebbles and the conglomerate up here, by the pressure, has pushed this material down into the soft mud. Okay, that tells you something pertinent. This mud down here had to have been soft when this came in. Stay soft for 20 million years? I don't think so. Not only were there no burrows or roots, but it stayed soft. And we found that the helicopter is very helpful, this kind of research. Okay, here's another one, Cambrian stromatolites. Stromatolites are structures, there's a cross-section here. You get layers of sand, and there are little bacteria called cyanobacteria that live on the surface. They put their little sticky fingers up, and it catches sand. Then they grow up through, you get another layer of sand. And so you get these things growing. And I'm convinced that some of these are indeed real, but these are being interpreted as stromatolites. But they're very different from this, and in more ways than I have time to explain right now. They're extremely different, and I don't think they're stromatolites. It's something else. And here, in a certain layer, you find them elongated, very elongated things. And you find them over many kilometers, maybe 100 cubic kilometers. You find these things, always in this same layer.